Right now, you are likely looking at a display that can effortlessly generate millions of distinct colors at the microscopic tap of your thumb. Color in the modern world is cheap, immediate, and utterly disposable. It is a digital setting on a device, a synthetic dye in a fast fashion shirt, a casual aesthetic choice we make without a single second thought. We are so utterly saturated with vivid hues from the moment we wake up to the moment we fall asleep that we have become blind to the profound influence color holds over our minds. But if we pull back the layers of time, past the industrial factories and the digital screens, we encounter a strange prehistoric reality that seems almost impossible to comprehend. Imagine walking through a landscape gripped by the throat of a brutal ice age. The air is so bitter it burns your lungs. Predatory beasts track your every footprint, and your small band of fellow humans is constantly on the absolute brink of starvation. In this environment, every single ounce of your energy must be spent on immediate survival. You cannot afford to carry extra weight, and you cannot afford to waste precious calories. Yet, as you pack your minimal belongings to cross an entire continent, you make sure to carry a heavy, dusty piece of red stone. But here's the thing. This was not an isolated, eccentric behavior of one desperate tribe. Archaeological sites spanning from the southern tip of Africa to the frozen steppes of Siberia and eventually into the untouched wilderness of the Americas all reveal the exact same phenomenon. Ancient humans were systematically mining, processing, and transporting a single earth pigment across thousands of miles of unforgiving terrain. They were not doing this for food, they were not doing it for weapons, and they were not doing it for shelter. They were doing it for a color. The real question is, why would a species fighting for its absolute survival on a wild planet prioritize a visual medium over practical utility? Why cross mountain ranges, navigate collapsing glaciers, and risk total extinction just to keep a supply of red dust close at hand? That raises a much bigger question about what actually makes us human, and how an ancient obsession with a single shade fundamentally built the world we inhabit today. To understand why our ancestors were willing to risk everything for this color, we have to look past the historical record and examine the very wiring of our brains. To understand why, we have to look at the evolutionary biology of sight itself. Our primate ancestors developed a highly specialized form of vision that set them apart from most other mammals on Earth. While a dog or a wolf views the world through a limited, dull palette, humans possess trichromatic vision, which allows us to perceive a vibrant spectrum of light. But our eyes are not equally calibrated to all colors. Evolution optimized our visual hardware to be exceptionally sensitive to the precise wavelengths of red. In the deep past, this was a matter of life and death. A hominid who could instantly spot a flash of red against a dense wall of green foliage could find ripe fruit, locate nutrient-dense berries, and identify poisonous threats from a distance. Let's go back further, to the moment our ancestors stepped out of the forests and onto the open savannas. Red took on an even more urgent psychological meaning. It became the color of blood, the ultimate signal of life, injury, and danger. It was the color of the fires that kept predators away in the dark. Our ancestors did not choose to obsess over this color by accident. Their brains were biologically calibrated to respond to it with intense focus long before they even possessed the language to describe it. The earliest reliable evidence of this obsession manifests in a dark, wave-battered cavern on the coast of South Africa, known as Blombos Cave. When archaeologists began excavating the site, they uncovered something truly extraordinary, dating back over 100,000 years. Deep within the sediment lay an ancient paint workshop. It contained abalone shells used as containers, ground iron oxide, animal fat, charcoal, and grindstones covered in crimson residue. This was not a casual discovery of a colored rock. It was a systematic, multi-step chemical recipe. Early humans were deliberately selecting specific chunks of iron oxide, known as ochre, scraping them into fine powder, and mixing them with liquefied bone marrow to create a long-lasting liquid paint. Think about that for a moment. At a time when modern humans were supposedly living primitive, reactive lives, they were engaging in complex chemistry to produce a color. The meaning of this discovery sent shockwaves through the scientific community. It proved that symbolic thought, the ability to let one thing represent another, existed tens of thousands of years earlier than previously assumed. The consequence of this cognitive leap was monumental. By turning a raw mineral into a consistent visual medium, these early humans had created the world's first external hard drive for the human mind, allowing ideas to be recorded, shared and preserved outside the human body. Now zoom out for a moment and observe how this single behavior began to escalate in scale, moving from individual actions to reshaping whole communities. Initially, a single human might have used the red powder to mark a tool or scratch a simple line on a stone. But as families gathered into larger social groups, the use of red ochre exploded. It became the foundational fabric of human culture. To see how this escalated, we can look at the emergence of the world's very first industrial activities. In the kingdom of Eswatini, nestled in the mountains of southern Africa, sits a site called Lion Cavern. Geologists and archaeologists investigating this location discovered that roughly 43,000 years ago, ancient humans were not just picking up loose rocks from the surface, they were systematically mining the hillside. Using heavy stone hammers, these ancient workers extracted an estimated 1,200 tons of specular iron ore. That alone would be remarkable. But what makes it truly staggering is that this massive, multi-generational mining effort was completely dedicated to gathering red and glittering ochre. Before humanity had invented agriculture, before we had built the first permanent towns, and before we had forged a single metal tool, we invented industrial mining exclusively to obtain a color. As communities grew into regional networks, this red dust became the primary currency of human identity, driving people to travel distances that defy imagination. Consider the remarkable archaeological case study of Lake Mungo in Australia. Around 40,000 years ago, a man was buried in the arid interior of the Australian continent. When his grave was excavated, scientists found that his body had been carefully laid out, his fingers locked together, and his entire skeleton completely covered in a thick, vibrant shroud of red ochre. But here's the thing. Geochemists analyzed the composition of that ochre and discovered it did not belong to the local geology. The specific mineral signature matched an ochre deposit located hundreds of kilometers away. For this ancient community to honor their dead, individuals had to trek across vast, inhospitable stretches of the Australian outback. They're carrying kilograms of heavy stone across entire regions just to perform a ritual of color. This was not a localized habit. It was a global phenomenon that seemed to escalate precisely when environmental conditions became most severe. Now it gets interesting when we look at how this behavior intensified during the absolute peak of the last glacial maximum, when massive ice sheets buried much of the northern hemisphere. In a windswept cave in Wales, archaeologists discovered an Upper Paleolithic burial known as the Red Lady of Paviland. Despite the name, the skeleton belonged to a young man who lived roughly 33,000 years ago, right when the glaciers were advancing across Europe. His bones were entirely saturated with red ochre, stained deep crimson by a community that prioritized the transport and application of this earth pigment in the dead of winter. Why would an Ice Age community living on the freezing edge of a glacial world expend precious energy gathering and preparing red powder for a grave? To understand why, we have to realize that during the bleak, pale winter of the Ice Age, the world was a monotonous canvas of white, gray, and black. Death brought a cold, pale stillness to the human body. By coating the deceased in rich, blood-red iron oxide, these ancient people were launching a profound symbolic rebellion against the cold indifference of nature. They were using the color of life and fire to simulate warmth and vitality, creating an early spiritual technology designed to bridge the terrifying gap between life and death. But that's only part of the story. For a long time, scientists assumed that this sophisticated relationship with color was a unique trademark of our own species, Homo sapiens. But recent discoveries have completely overturned this assumption, introducing a stunning historical contradiction. In the Netherlands, at an archaeological site called Maastricht Belvedere, researchers discovered drops of rich red ochre liquid embedded in soil layers that are over 250,000 years old. This was long before modern humans ever set foot in Europe. The beings who dropped that pigment were Neanderthals. They were deliberately collecting iron oxide blocks, grinding them on stones, and mixing them with water to create liquid solutions. This means our obsession with the color red is actually older than our entire species. It is a deep, underlying evolutionary drive that predates modern human anatomy, suggesting that the search for color was one of the primary catalysts that pushed the minds of multiple hominid species out of the animal kingdom and into the realm of abstract thought. As the Ice Age progressed, the search for this color forced humans to execute the most ambitious migrations in human history, literally driving them to cross entire continents. As populations migrated out of Africa and across the vast Eurasian landmass, they encountered the brutal, sub-zero landscapes of Siberia. At sites like Malta Buret near Lake Baikal, researchers found Ice Age settlements where ivory figurines, beads, and tools were all heavily treated with red ochre. These people were living in some of the most extreme cold conditions ever endured by our species. Yet their toolkit consistently included the heavy stones required to grind iron oxide. And this is where everything changed. Around 15,000 years ago, a small group of these Siberian hunters pushed eastward, crossing the exposed land bridge of Beringia into the entirely unpeopled continent of the Americas. They left behind no written records, no wheels, and no permanent stone monuments. But they brought their color. When archaeologists excavated the Anzik site in Montana, they discovered the oldest known human burial in North America. A young child belonging to the Clovis culture, dating back over 12,600 years. Alongside the child were dozens of beautifully crafted stone tools, all completely covered in a thick, dense layer of deep red ochre. The identical ritual that began in the caves of South Africa over 100,000 years prior had survived a journey across continents, oceans of ice, and generations of nomadic wandering. The pigment had been carried across the top of the world through thousands of miles of uninhabited wilderness to anchor the identity of the very first Americans. But this raises an intense paradox that puzzled researchers for decades. Why would a material with seemingly zero practical value be treated as an absolute necessity during a grueling continental migration? If ochre was purely an artistic or religious luxury, it should have been discarded when survival became precarious. But it wasn't. And this is where a brilliant perspective shift occurred in modern archaeology. Scientists began conducting replication studies, treating ancient materials with iron oxide to see what happened on a physical level. The results were stunning. They discovered that red ochre is not just a visual pigment, it is a highly effective chemical agent. When rubbed onto human skin, iron oxide acts as a powerful, all-natural insect repellent, keeping dangerous disease-carrying pests away. It blocks ultraviolet radiation, serving as the world's very first sunscreen in harsh, high-altitude or exposed environments. Even more incredible, the iron particles chemically interact with animal fats, preventing organic lipids from breaking down. This means that if you rub ochre onto animal hides, it acts as a potent preservative, stopping the leather from rotting in damp environments. Furthermore, when mixed with plant resin, iron oxide alters the chemical curing process, turning brittle tree sap into a super strong, resilient adhesive capable of hafting stone points onto wooden spear shafts. Suddenly, the contradiction completely dissolves. Our ancestors were not impractical romantics risking their lives solely for an aesthetic dream, nor were they purely utilitarian survivalists. They had found a miraculous substance where art and engineering were completely fused. A block of red ochre was a multi-tool for the mind and the body. It was part chemical armor, part manufacturing adhesive, and part spiritual medium. When an Ice Age hunter coated their spear in red ochre, they were simultaneously reinforcing the physical bond of the glue and charging the weapon with the psychological power of a sacred symbol. The search for this color did not distract from survival. It directly enabled it. Because this single material possessed such immense practical and symbolic value, it became the primary catalyst for the world's very first long-distance trade routes. Long before the existence of the Silk Road, before the exchange of spices, and before the valuation of gold, blocks of premium red ochre were moving along vast prehistoric highways. In ancient Europe, highly vibrant, deep red ochre mined from specific regions was traded across thousands of kilometers, passing through dozens of distinct human groups. This commerce in color forced isolated, nomadic bands of hunter-gatherers to do something completely counter to their defensive instincts: communicate with strangers. To obtain the premium pigment, separate tribes had to establish peace treaties, negotiate exchange rates, lay out common pathways, and develop shared symbolic languages. The pursuit of a single color laid the foundational infrastructure for global human commerce, creating the very concepts of trade, diplomacy, and cross-cultural connectivity that would later allow civilizations to flourish. Now, zoom back to the present moment. Think about that ordinary smartphone screen in your hand, or the painted walls of the room you are currently sitting in. It is easy to look at the vast spectrum of modern synthetic colors and assume we have completely broken free from our primitive past. But look closer. If you look at the ingredients of your high-end cosmetics, the baseline pigments of premium paints, or the concrete stains that color our modern architectural landscapes, you will find a familiar ingredient listed over and over again: iron oxide. It is the exact same chemical compound that our ancestors mined at Lion Cavern 43,000 years ago. It is literally rust, the very same substance that colors the surface of Mars, that forms the clay bricks of our cities, and that stained the bones of the Ice Age hunters, is still anchoring the visual landscape of our modern civilization. When you look at a vivid red image on your digital display, your brain experiences a sudden, involuntary spike in neurological attention. That instantaneous chemical reaction inside your modern mind is an unbroken echo of an ancient evolutionary survival mechanism. You are participating in a psychological chain that stretches back through hundreds of thousands of years of human history. Our obsession with visual expression and symbolic communication did not begin with the invention of digital screens, oil paintings, or classical sculptures. It was forged in the dirt, written in blood-red rock across the vast, lonely continents of an unforgiving Earth. You started here, looking at a modern screen, viewing color as a cheap, disposable setting on a device, a minor convenience of our hyper-advanced world. But now you understand what was truly hidden behind it. You see that the simple ability to project a single shade was the very engine that drove our ancestors out of Africa, pushed them across frozen continents, forced them to invent the first industries, and compelled them to build the first global networks of human trade. We did not cross the world and build civilization because we survived. We built civilization because we were looking for a way to express who we were through a single